let's explore our relationship as humans to risk. When we think about risky play, these are usually the images that come to mind. Crazy stuff, seemingly defying rational thought. As an emergency physician, this is the bread and butter of my day. But as a pediatrician and a wilderness educator, I think about risky play as starting earlier in life. Playing in the dirt, running through mud, jumping, climbing, getting lost, whittling, playing in the dark. But sadly, these sorts of images of children are becoming more and more rare. Over the last few decades, there's been a 50% decline in the amount of time children spend engaged in free and risky play. David Eager, a professor of engineering and a safety expert from Australia, coined the term risk deficit disorder to describe this trend. So what's behind this decline in free play and risky play in children? Unfortunately, these days, we view risk as something negative, something to be avoided. If you ask parents, they're afraid their children are going to be abducted, a fear that is belied by actual statistics. They're afraid their children are going to be injured or exposed to poisonous plants or animals. Once again, concerns that underestimate a child's ability to evaluate and manage risk. We seem to view our kids as less competent, less responsible, less trustworthy than we were when we were young. In one study, 70% of mothers reported daily outdoor free play when they were young, but only 30% allowed their children to do the same. We're also in an era of intensive parenting, shuttling our children from one scheduled activity to the other with little time for unstructured play. When kids do get a chance to play outside, it's often on playgrounds that have been over-engineered to be safe, unchallenging, as my child says, unfun. Nothing high, few things that spin, and very little that allows them to balance or hang upside down. But sadly, these days, most children are spending their time indoors, amidst the glow of the television set or the buzz of video games. In one study of 800 Canadian kids, ages 6 to 11, children reported an average of 7.5 hours of screen time every day. Now, there's been a lot in the press about the health consequences of this decline in active play in kids, notably a rise in obesity, an accelerated cardiovascular disease, and an earlier onset of metabolic syndromes like diabetes or high cholesterol. But what about the effects on the brain and the nervous system? In her groundbreaking new book, Balanced and Barefoot, Angela Hanscom, a pediatric occupational therapist, chronicles the rise in sensory, motor, and balance problems in children that may be the consequence of this decline in risky and free play. These days, 1 in 6 children is referred to occupational or physical therapy for problems that used to be rare. Basically, bodies that are left unchallenged don't develop properly. So what exactly do we mean by risky play? So at its core, risky play is child-directed. It allows a child to recognize and evaluate a challenge and decide upon a course of action. It may involve height or speed or dangerous tools like knives or axes. It may involve dangerous elements like fire or cliffs or fast-moving water, deep water, or uneven terrain. It may occur in the dark. It may involve the possibility of getting lost. It is her opinion and mine that such risky play provides the optimal state for the development of neural pathways for sensory integration, motor function, and balance. Walking barefoot in the mud, breeze in the face, birds chirping, jumping, climbing, managing risk, all without the sensory overload of screen time. So, what kind of problems can arise in kids that are deprived of such experiences? Well, scientists have long known that early exposure to a variety of different sensory inputs, vision, hearing, smell, taste, touch, proprioception, all enhance the development of the neural pathways between the sensory organs and the brain, and also enhance tolerance to a variety of different sensory stimuli. So, for example, kids who are never given an opportunity to play outside in weather or to walk barefoot in sand or mud may not be able to tolerate wind in their face or rain on their bodies or muddy hands or feet. Children develop their sense of vision by moving briskly, jumping or swinging, and looking around at the same time. And if deprived of these experiences, their visual systems may not develop well. Children enhance their sense of hearing by learning to listen in 3 dimensions, walking barefoot through the forest, trying to identify the location of a bird call provides a perfect opportunity for this. By lifting heavy objects, pushing, pulling, climbing, children develop their sense of proprioception, where their bodies and limbs are in space without looking. Without these experiences, children may fall a lot or have a difficult time regulating their physical interactions with other kids. Notably in games of tag, they may just push too hard. Bringing together all of these different sensory inputs is referred to as sensory integration, and kids who are deprived of some of these physical challenges of childhood may not develop good sensory integration. What about motor development? Well, in order to develop accurate and strong gross motor skills, children need to activate the large muscle groups of their core, their arms, and their legs. Risky play does this through jumping and climbing, running on uneven terrain, and around obstacles. And really, in order to develop these systems well, young children need to do this for 5 to 8 hours a day, and even elementary school kids need 3 or 4 hours a day of this kind of activity. But sadly, that's not happening these days. And the consequences are apparent when you look at strength. So 20 years ago, only 1 out of every 20 kids was unable to support their weight hanging off of the bars. By 2008, that number had doubled and continues to rise. Walking barefoot is another really important thing, not only to develop arch strength and balance, but also for tactile processing on the feet. But most children, many children, aren't being allowed to walk barefoot because of safety concerns. What about the vestibular system? So the vestibular system is super important because it coordinates balance, eye position, posture, and attention. So spinning, rolling down hills, hanging upside down, all enhance the development of this system. And kids who don't get an opportunity to engage in these sorts of activities, either because they're not playing outside or because they're playing on these over-engineered playgrounds, may not properly develop this system, and they may fall a lot. Now, the other thing that the vestibular system is super important for is coordinating attention and concentration. Children who don't have well-developed vestibular systems will fidget or rock back and forth in order to activate this system and keep alert. And if you talk to teachers, there's a lot of that kind of behavior happening in the classroom these days. And what about decision-making? Well, decision-making is kind of like a muscle that needs to be exercised. Studies have shown that when children are allowed to follow their natural instincts and expose themselves to risk, they develop clear strategies for minimizing harm. They become more resilient, more confident, more self-controlled. They're better able to work in groups. They're more adaptable, and they're more have better ability to regulate their emotions. Play that involves child direction, not adult direction, is what's key. So organized sports don't have the same effect. Let's dive a little bit deeper into this particular impact of risky play in childhood. Do risky play experiences early in life affect risk-taking decisions in adolescence? If we never learn how to manage the risks around climbing a tree or walking across a stream on a log or making our way through a forest, how can we negotiate more high-risk decisions like sexuality, drugs, or extreme sports? To understand this a little better, let's take a look at brain development. By the age of 6, our brains are 90% of adult size, but there's a whole lot of dynamic changes still happening in the brain. When it comes to risk-taking, there's 2 parts of the brain in particular that are critical, the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, and both of these are undergoing a lot of changes during adolescence. The limbic system is responsible for reward processing, emotions, risk-taking, while the prefrontal cortex controls our impulses. It's kind of like the police for the limbic system. Now, advances in MRI technology have been amazing. They allow us to look at the development of these various regions of the brain, the structure and size, their level of activity, their interconnectedness. So what does MRI tell us? Well, it's helpful to think about nerve cells or neurons as an aspen tree, like this, with regions of the brain represented by groves and the forest representing the brain itself. As nerve cells or neurons grow, they develop more branches or dendrites. Their bark or myelin sheath becomes thicker and more efficient at transmitting messages, and they become more interconnected. dopamine, which is a stimulatory chemical in the brain, kind of like a fertilizer of sorts, starts to bathe the limbic system earlier and more generously than it does the prefrontal cortex. And GABA, which is kind of like an inhibitory chemical in the brain, kind of a don't do it chemical, is really hard to find. So believe it or not, so in childhood, both the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system are similarly small and undeveloped, but they're balanced. So children are impulsive, but they're not driven to take great risks for rewards or emotional reasons. In fact, studies have shown that children can be pretty analytical when it comes to taking risks. They take risks, but they consider the hazards. In adolescence, this balance is lost because the limbic system develops much earlier and more rapidly than the prefrontal cortex, becoming a forest while the prefrontal cortex remains a sapling. So let's take a closer look at what are some of the determinants of risk-taking in adolescence. So on an individual level, gender and temperament are particularly important. Boys, and some more so than others, tend to take more physical risks. Girls, more social and emotional risks. Messages from, and more importantly, the actions of our siblings and our parents also affect risk-taking behavior. And peer influences are well established by the age of 8. What about risk experiences in early childhood? Now, emerging research and trends in behavioral health suggest 2 ways in which limited experience with risk in early childhood can affect risk-taking behavior in adolescence. Now, young children have natural and appropriate fears based upon their abilities, and as they expose themselves to risk, they outgrow these fears as their skills develop. Without risky play, children may never experience this ability to cope with and overcome their fears and may develop extreme risk aversion and anxiety. And that's what we're seeing, actually. According to the National Institutes of Mental Health, anxiety is epidemic among our children, with nearly 1 in 4 children diagnosed with a disorder. At the other end, limited opportunities to experience risk or manage risk and experience the negative consequences of risky play in childhood can lead to excessive risk-taking in adolescence. And studies have shown, in fact, that there's a lot of variability in the development of the prefrontal cortex, with more mature adolescent decision makers having increased activity in this region of the brain. And studies in rats have actually shown the same thing. Rats with plentiful free play opportunities have enhanced maturation of their prefrontal cortex and better impulse control. So using this analogy of the aspen tree, early and ample risky play opportunities may actually feed that prefrontal cortex. So by the time they reach adolescence, it doesn't lag so far behind the limbic system. Better impulse control to balance that desire for rewards would be a boon for any adolescent, and certainly an adolescent who may already be predisposed to higher risk-taking behavior because of their temperament. Children already report that they are happiest when they are engaged in free play. And this may seem intuitive, but here are a bunch more reasons why we should let children do what feels natural to them. Kids know what they need to develop their brains, their bodies, their senses. So let's get out of their way and let them wander and explore, play in the dirt, climb high, whittle, play near fire, take risks, and make mistakes. Because this is the best education that we can offer them. Thank you.